Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews, where I give you bits of vampire information. Sometimes 8, sometimes 16, depending on your platform. Let's talk about the new Netflix Castlevania series. For those of you who reside under rocks, Castlevania is a classic video game franchise in which a family of vampire hunters, the Belmonts, fight Dracula, generation after generation. But before we get into the story, first of all, finally, right? The games are over 30 years old and just now got an adaptation. This is especially satisfying after the announcement 12 years ago in 2005 of a live-action film in the works that was eventually scrapped. The new version is an animated adaptation, with a script by renowned comic book writer Warren Ellis for Frederator Studios, who's been trying to get it made since they acquired the rights in 2007. They finally got funding for it 2 years ago, and it premiered on July 7th as a Netflix original series. And it is short. Really short. It's only 4 23-ish minute episodes and finishes with a complete non-ending where the group of heroes decide to go do the thing. That's it. They just decide that, yes, they are going to save the world from Dracula. They walk into the camera and then done. Roll credits, story's over just as it's getting started. There's a reason for this. When Ellis was hired to write the script 10 years ago, it was originally for a direct-to-video animated film. And he decided there was simply too much story for one 80-minute movie, so he conceived a trilogy. All 3 films were planned, and when Netflix acquired the series, they adapted the first in the trilogy for their season 1. But the following 2 parts are coming in an 8-episode season 2. They are! It's confirmed! We only have to wait a year. If you're familiar with the franchise, you'll notice our 3 heroes here are from Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse, which is a prequel to the original Castlevania game. So instead of featuring the classic hero of the series most people are familiar with, Simon Belmont, the story is set 200 years earlier and features Simon's ancestor, the fearsome warrior Trevor. His buddies here are 2 of the other playable characters in Dracula's Curse, and the adaptation sticks to the lore of the games pretty tightly. Konami made Warren Ellis do 8 rewrites on his script until he got it right after all. Of course, everyone agreed to cut out the 4th playable character from this version. Nobody likes Grant. So the original game, in which Simon Belmont fights a very classic Hollywood horror-style Dracula, is set in 1691, which is kind of a random year for Dracula. Later, the franchise jumped on the bandwagon of headcanoning Dracula's backstory to make him literally Vlad the Impaler, and set the prequel Castlevania 3 game in the year of Vlad's death, 1476, supposedly the year he stopped being an actual historical person and became a vampire. This was retconned in an even prequelier prequel made 14 years later that shows Dracula as a human becoming a vampire in the year 1094. Who then later decided to become Vlad the Impaler, you know, as you do. I guess he had to keep himself busy doing something between 1094 and the events of Bram Stoker's novel. Only one Belmont to fight per generation, after all. But as much as the showmakers gushed about how Game of Thronesy this video game adaptation was going to be, I have the feeling they chose the 1476 timeline in big part for aesthetic reasons. But it's also a more interesting story than the simpler Simon games, and combining the backstory lore elaborated on in later games into the plot of Dracula's Curse, it serves as a compelling origin point for the characters, especially Dracula himself, even if it's not Dracula's actual origin. Maybe they'll give us flashback scenes of that in season 2, but probably not. I'll explain why I think that in a minute. First, I want to say that as the story of the series is so similar to the games, yes, my criticism is of both in some ways. However, tonight, the series is our focus as its own creature. Episode 1 starts with an amazing character who's not a vampire, but we'll still look at her for a minute. This is Lisa, who has a pretty awesome name, and she's introduced to us by shanking a bat on the front steps of a spooky castle surrounded by impaled corpses. She is apparently the only person in the world brave enough to walk up to Dracula's door and ask him to share his brilliant scientific knowledge with her so that she can become a doctor to help and serve others. Even though he makes rape and murder threats within the first 2 minutes of meeting her, she powers through her perfectly natural fear, stands up to him, puts him in his place, and wins his respect and admiration. The prerogatives of her active agency lead her to speak to him of the potential of humanity, and she offers him a new perspective on the world. Even though we know nothing about Dracula at this point, other than that he's a vampire with a frightening reputation, we see a dynamic quality in his character as he reacts to this woman. He is someone capable of change and growth, a person with a heart. And already the series is setting him up as a sympathetic and complex character, a far cry from the cackling Halloween prop Dracula the first games gave us. So naturally, Dracula falls in love with Lisa. They get married, have a baby, he becomes a nice guy who doesn't hurt humans anymore, and they live happily ever after. No. 20 years later, Lisa gets stuffed in the refrigerator, accused of witchcraft for her sciencey ways, and is burnt at the stake. And this sparks Dracula's motivation to wage a war on mankind as revenge. This is all in episode 1, by the way. We'll call it the prologue, because the real action of the show starts a year later as the world reacts to Dracula's war. And my biggest disappointment in the show is that after he declares his revenge on humanity for killing his wife, we never see Dracula again. He's not in any of the other episodes. In fact, there are no vampires at all in episodes 2 and 3. Just these hell demon bat things. I really hope Dracula comes back in season 2 as the dynamic and sympathetic character the prologue set him up to be. And I mean, before the inevitable final showdown, because if he continues to just be this scary floating force head and not a person through the rest of the series, it will be a huge waste of opportunity. The thing about Dracula adaptations is that he's been done as an antagonistic force so many times over the decades that there's no suspense in him being simply the bad guy anymore. And this show seems to get that, so I hope they don't drop the ball. Yes, Dracula is obviously a villain here, but he's not shallowly just evil for the sake of evil like he was in the first games. No, you see, the real villain here is the church! Ooh, edgy! Particularly this guy, the bishop, who was the man responsible for burning Lisa at the stake. But he also has practically every priest in his realm acting in distinctly unpriestly violent ways to enforce his authoritarian, hostile, anti-progress churchy takeover.
To all intents and purposes, I will be the church.
Now, that's not to say that God is the villain. The story is distinctly theistic. God does exist, even in this fantasy world of alchemy and elemental magic. But the establishment of the church, represented by this bishop and his underlings, is corrupt, you see. Not true agents of God. And though God seems to be taking a passive stance on what's happening on Earth with this apocalypse of raised demons literally from hell, the fact that the bishop is corrupt exempts him and his church from God's protection. Thus, he is eventually reduced to merely a victim of the vampire rather than its true enemy. Though the church is irredeemable in its antagonism towards Dracula and at fault for the subsequent consequences that has on humanity, it cannot be the vampire's true rival because it is not a real representation of goodness once Dracula becomes bad. Again, it is actually Lisa who is the embodiment of the true Christian. Her devotion to the well-being of her fellow humans, to the benefit of the world's progress, and her eventual sacrifice of her life for her cause is so Christ-like that she'd be sprouting stigmata if it were any more Jesus-y. The show changed her pyre from a literal cross, like it was in the game, to a more classic stake burning, but it still has her cry out a paraphrased version of some of Jesus' last words on the cross.
They don't know what they're doing. Be better than them. Please!
You know, in case it was too subtle for you. And yes, I am saying that Lisa is the true enemy of the vampire in this sense. While she lived, she tamed Dracula. She stripped what was vampire about him away from his character. It was her goodness that was his undoing as a vampire, but his doing as a person. Without her saintly influence, Dracula immediately devolves into a force of pure evil, despite having had 20 years of emotional character growth from living with her.
Kill for my love. Kill for the only true love I ever knew.
That part right there is why I suspect they won't be including Dracula's origin backstory in the next season, because according to game lore as of 2003, 4 years before this script was first drafted, Lisa was not Dracula's first wife. No, that was Elisabetha, also an awesome name, and he definitely loved her. There's been retconny excuses for the my only love line in the game still being valid on technicalities, but this script was 2007. If they were going to include that, they would have fixed that, right? Elisabetha was the whole reason he became a vampire. They pinched the backstory of the popular 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula film and had Elisabetha die in 1094, which is why, as a human, he did the magical anti-god curse stuff to become Dracula. Then, when he met Lisa 400 years later, she reminded him of his dead wife, or maybe even was her reincarnated. And you know, the series is probably better off without all that nonsense. It doesn't really matter how Dracula became a vampire. He's clearly been at it for a while. And how many women do we really need stuffed in the fridge for Dracula's man pain? Lisa's enough to get him going. Halfway through the first episode, I was getting so excited this series was going to be Dracula's story. If his previous undoing as a vampire was the love and goodness of his wife, maybe some similar dynamic character development would be the solution to his apocalyptic tantrum. That's the journey I want to follow him on. To have him be the central figure as an anti-hero who either has to learn and grow or inevitably fail, the Tony Soprano of medieval vampire gore fighting a two-sided battle against heroes better than him on one side and a villain worse than him on the other. But nope. The bishop gets eaten by hell demons without ever even meeting Dracula, the church is taken out of the mix, and we're left with our scrappy band of heroes out to fight a war against an antagonist we now probably won't get to see again until the final boss fight. The series is especially video gamey. If you thought the first episode felt like an extended prologue cutscene intro sequence, you're in for it with the rest. Once we meet our actual protagonist, the mighty warrior asshole Trevor, he spends 3 episodes listening to NPC exposition dumps, going on side quests, and having some mini-boss fights. I'm not sure if the showrunners made it this way as a deliberate homage to the games, or were simply incapable of creatively transitioning the material into a more film-like story. Either way, it's to the show's detriment. You can practically see the text boxes pop up. There's no excuse for something only 4 episodes long to feel so padded. Trevor here is such a reluctant badass hero cliche.
He's rude.
Because rude men are cool, not whipped. See, he's not whipped.
What did you do in the face of that?
I didn't run away.
Really? So what are you running to?
Even though the Belmont family has been protecting the country from forces of darkness for generations, the evil, evil church decided they were to blame for the forces being there in the first place and punished and ruined the family. Trevor is the last Belmont, and he's living a destitute life of drunken uselessness, haunted by the shadows of his family and rejecting the call to be a hero because of his bitterness.
It is not dying that frightens us. It's living without ever having done our best.
I don't care.
Oh, here's a good guideline for you. Say something once and it's a fortune cookie. Say something twice and it's a theme. By the end of episode 3, Trevor's tune is changed.
And it's not the dying that frightens us. It's never having stood up and fought for you.
He's finally ready to rise to the challenge, defeat the evil priests, and accepts his destiny. Despite what a jerk he is and the tough talk he talks, inside he's just too good of a guy to not go fight some vampires. This brings me to the second actual vampire in the show. Damper, technically. This is Alucard, son of Dracula. Is it traditional to name your kid your own name spelled backwards? How come I never got this vampire memo? Nevum. Oh, has a nice ring. The games named him after the character in the 1943 Son of Dracula film, but at some point someone must have realized just how doofy that was, so his real name is actually Adrian. Cause that's so much more badass. Poor guy.
I'm Adrian Tepesh.
In vain with his backwards name, Alucard is meant to be a mirror to Dracula. an inversion.
I need help to save Wallachia. Perhaps the world. And defeat my father.
He's only a teenager, 20 at the most, but he had the Christ-like Lisa for a mother, so he's already more morally perfect than most of the adults we meet.
It is what my mother would have wanted.
Makes me wonder what Dracula was like as a dad. He must have been pretty decent, at least for a while, to turn out such a well-adjusted son.
I grieve with you, but I won't let you commit genocide.
I really hope it gets explained in Season 2 why Alucard couldn't save his mom from the fire. He can practically teleport. What kept him from just grabbing her and running? Trevor and his magical lady sidekick find Alucard sleeping in a coffin, where he spent a year recovering from the fight with his dad. Of course, Trevor must first have a boss fight to prove himself worthy before Alucard deigns to explain himself. As contrived as the fight scene is, though, it does tie into one of the story's other themes. Like Trevor, Alucard is the victim of his family's past and expectations. He struggles with escaping the shadow cast by his dark heritage. He's much better about powering through his bitterness at the assumptions people make about him based on his family connections than Trevor is, but ultimately they are both battling the same demons here. Literally and metaphorically. The monsters in one's past are symbolized here by actual monsters. Learning to face your problems instead of running from them or hiding in a coffin for a year. Alucard's is a vampire's struggle that a human like Trevor can relate to.
I know what it's like to be persecuted by your own country for the accident of your birth.
How do each of them, from opposite sides of the fence here, manage to embrace their individualities while balancing their destinies and obligations? Of course, the show ends before it actually goes anywhere with these ideas, but here's hoping Season 2 will show us a change in Trevor's worldview or something through his experience with this vampire character.
Do you care?
I care about doing my family's work.
And this isn't the only parallel Trevor has to a vampire's point of view.
Any one of them could have stood up and said, no, we won't behave like animals anymore.
For evil bastards to win power, all ordinary people have to do is stand aside and keep quiet.
Everyone's just so persecuted in this world of passivity and fear. These are all interesting themes the show sets up. I am ready to see where they're going with them when they actually continue the story in a year. Yeah, can't deny that Season 1 does leave me wanting more, though in kind of a cheap way. But maybe this was really the best they could do? We've been waiting so long for a Castlevania adaptation that, you know what? I'll take it. It's got pretty simple source material to work with, and it is trying to deepen the ideas. The art is so cool looking, the acting is great, the intro sequence is awesome, and the story stuff can only get better in Season 2, right? The 8 episodes of next season will cover parts 2 and 3 of Warren Ellis's original trilogy scripts, but supposedly that's just the events of Castlevania 3's 1476 timeline. The franchise has over 500 years of subsequent lore. If the series does well, it could keep going. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and oh, I have to go tell my spawn that his new name is Nevum now. A lot of people over the past couple weeks on comments and on Twitter asking me if I was going to do a video on the new Castlevania series, and I was actually already planning on it since I first heard about the show months ago, but if there's something that you'd like to see a review of that I'm not already planning on doing, Patreon is where you should go to make your case. You can actually request that I do reviews through my rewards levels, but otherwise you can make suggestions and we can chat about it there. Patreon's where it's at. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe. Good night.